So Charles Darwin has created a theory that explains why evolution happens. And he creates this theory first by making observations. Observation number one, these are important, write them down. Individuals in a population vary in their heritable characteristics. That means that in a population there's diversity, there's variation, and it's not variation that was acquired in one's lifetime, like Lamarck talked about, but it's variation that was inherited in the genes thanks to mutation and meiosis and things like that. So individuals vary in their heritable characteristics. If the characteristic can't be passed on to the next generation, it doesn't affect evolution. Organisms produced more offspring than the environment can support. That's another way of saying more offspring are produced than survive. All right, so what are the inferences then? So these are observations, what you can see. What can you infer based on that? One, individuals that are well suited to their environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. We've talked about that. Those who are lucky, they win the genetic lottery. They have just the right traits to survive and reproduce in an environment, leave more offspring than those that don't have that combination of genes. Therefore, over time, favorable traits will accumulate in the population. The population changes, evolves. So remember, this is a theory, which is a well-established and tested explanation for natural phenomena. So let me just be clear. When Darwin published his ideas, they were more of like hypotheses that had been tested. But over time, it's developed into a full-blown theory. So from a theory, we can make more specific hypotheses. A theory is broad and vague, but it has great explanatory power. And then we can make more narrow hypotheses and test them. And a useful theory, like evolution, can be used to make and test predictions. So we'll look at a few things we would expect to see in the natural world if Darwin's theory is correct. Okay? So, we should be able to see various patterns. We've talked about the process and patterns. We should see certain patterns if evolution is true. For example, closely related organisms should be more similar physically and especially genetically. And we know that that is true, right? A sister and a brother are very similar genetically, more so than a sister and a cousin. Same thing between species. There will be transitional forms in the fossil record. That's something that we should see. We would predict to see that. We should be able to find that. And distantly related organisms may occasionally have similar traits because they may adapt to similar environments. That's something we might see if evolution is true. And there are other things we will expect to see as well. These are just some examples of things we would expect to see if evolution is true. So prediction. Closely related organisms will be more similar. Well, we can see that in the fossil record, we can see that in living things, and we can see that in the DNA. Let's look at physical traits because they're easier to think about than genes for now. But we call these similar traits homologous traits. You've heard that word before when we talked about similar chromosomes, right? Homologous traits are traits shared due to a common ancestor. So I kind of drew that earlier. So if you have a common ancestor, let me try to get my pen to work here. If two organisms share a common ancestor, so here's organism A and B on this tree, and this common ancestor had wings, we would probably expect organism A and B to also have wings, and they inherited those wings from the common ancestor, so it's a homologous trait. It's a trait shared between organisms due to common ancestry. And we can see this in their shape or morphology. So we can say that homologous traits are include cells, vertebrae, things like that. We can also see it in not just morphology, but also in DNA, in similar genes. So one organism might have CCG at a gene, the other organism would also have CCG at that particular gene. Now, that's just a short example of a short piece of DNA, right? They'll have more similar DNA. That's homologous as well. Another thing we see in physical traits morphology are vestigial traits that are homologous. Vestigial traits are traits that we share with another organism, but maybe in one or more of us, they're not well developed because we don't really use them much anymore, but we still have them. They haven't gone away. So humans have tailbones, showing that we once had a tail or we had ancestors with tails. Whales often have hip bones that are not really connected to anything, but the genes for hip bones are still there, so they have a genetic homologous trait. And then very small but not fully formed hip bones are still there. Those are vestigial hip bones. Okay, DNA, I said we can have homologous DNA, that's similar nucleotide sequences, and hidden genes are also common. Hidden genes are when you realize, hey, why do humans have the gene for gills? Humans have genes for gills. Why is that? That's weird, right? And then atavisms are a particular case when hidden genes get turned on by accident. So let me point out that vestigial traits are usually found in all members of a species, whereas atavisms are only found in some individuals of a species where they happen to turn on. So occasionally a human will be born not with fully formed gills, but with little lines by their ear that indicate some part of the gill gene was turned on. Or you may have a human born with a tail. That is an atavism. So when a human being is born with a tail, we all have the genes for a tail, but it's normally shut off. But in some humans, it's turned on, and a human has a tail. That's called an atavism. And that's a type of homologous trait that we share with other mammals, but it's normally turned off. But sometimes we get to see it when it's accidentally turned on. So here's examples of homologous traits. The bones in our forearms are the same as the bones in the front legs of other mammals, in the wings of bats, and the flippers of whales, and the genes that code for those bones are similar in all of us. And once again, that's because all of us mammals, or all of us tetrapods, four-legged creatures, share a common ancestor that had these bones and had the genes for those bones. Now, we modify them in different ways in these different critters, but we all share them. We, once again, would predict that more similar organisms would have more similar DNA. And we can see that. Homologous nucleotide sequences. Remember, nucleotides are A, T, C, and G. We see more similar DNA in more closely related organisms. Let's look at vestigial traits and atavisms then. So these are those weird examples where things show up that we wouldn't expect to see. So a vestigial trait is a diminutive homologous trait, meaning kind of a not well-developed homologous trait. So in a lot of mammals, there are tails. In humans, we have tailbones. We don't have fully formed tails. And they're found in all humans. Tailbones are in pretty much all humans. That's a vestigial trait. Okay? Now, an atavism is a throwback, like when the genes for a tail in a human occasionally get turned on, and they show that humans still have the genes for tailbones and they can still develop a tail. And we have those genes because they're left over from our tailed ancestors. And occasionally that happens. That's an atavism. And here's a whale with a hip bone. So what would that be? Is a whale with a hip bone, if it's found in all whales, or all killer whales, or all whatever, what species of whale? That's not a killer whale. If it's on, let's just say all humpback whales. If all humpback whales have hip bones, what would that be? Well, that would be a vestigial trait. But if one whale was born that had little stubby legs, that would be an atavism. But it is all clues. It's all clues to the scientist about the evolutionary history of that organism. Things that they have in their DNA that are either always on or occasionally turned on that reveal their ancestry. Let me do another example before I stop this short video. So birds, for example, we know by comparing their DNA and by looking at their fossils and all of that, that birds are a type of reptile. And that they are closely related to the dinosaurs. If you look at this tree of life, this is called a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree. We can see that birds are closely related to dinosaurs. Of course, all these dinosaurs are extinct, so if you draw a tree of only living things, birds come out as being closely related to crocodiles, which seems really weird, right? Now, if birds are closely related to all these reptiles, we would expect that they would have the genes for teeth, even though birds don't have teeth. That they might have the genes for teeth. And those teeth would be kind of like those of crocodiles or dinosaurs. Well, occasionally we see this. We see atovisms in unhatched chicks. These chicks usually don't survive and hatch, but we can see that, first of all, chickens have the genes for teeth. We found those genes. And that occasionally those teeth get turned on. The genetic instructions for teeth are still in the genome. Here we can see those teeth that have developed in a baby chick, here, a chicken. And they look almost exactly the same as the way teeth develop in an alligator. So we can see that the genes for teeth are homologous in chickens and alligators, and that when they do develop in birds, they have the same morphology, they have the same shape, they have the same look as the teeth in alligators. So those are clues that chickens and alligators really do share a common ancestor. Pretty cool.